I'm clicking a button. Oh, okay. YouTube says we're live. Maybe?
Maybe.
Maybe. It looks like it's a black box from here. Oh, nope. We're definitely live. Okay. Alright, we got that.
Cool.
I'm gonna move my little mouse off the screen so that it's not like bobbling around while we're talking. Hey guys! We're doing a Betwixt the Books discuss. First Betwixt the Books content since the beginning of the year because I got wicked sick. Thanks, Rona. But I'm feeling better. I'm going back to work this coming week. So hopefully we can get back and do some stuff and actually get together and do things regularly instead of just once and then not again for 2 months.
Is that not the official Betwixt the Books schedule? Have I been mistaken this entire time?
Once and then not again until, I guess I kind of feel like it. Let's do it now. Alright, so today we're going to be chiming in on a discussion that has been happening both on BookTube and Book Twitter and probably Book TikTok and everywhere else, Book Reddit, wherever it is. It's probably all over the place. But we're going to give a quick disclaimer. Like, you can see us. Obviously, we are white. We also both are femme-presenting individuals. So, like, we have the woman minority. I identify as non-binary, but I am definitely female presenting, and my body agrees with that as well. So I am, like, if people look at me and they see, oh, look, a woman. So keep that in mind. I'm also asexual, so I'm in the queer community. So when we talk about that aspect of this, I do have an Own Voices response to that. But there's elements of this discussion that are about race, and we cannot come from a place of Own Voices in that instance. So just keep that in mind. Because of that, I have linked down below 3 videos from booktubers of color who have also discussed these topics, and I encourage you to go watch their discussions, and then also especially to look into their comment sections because they're larger than us, and there's actually a very large, diverse group of people discussing these topics down there as well. But we wanted to chime in because we maybe have a different view than most, because we have a little bit, I don't know, we got a little bit of a different take on it, but we also wanted to discuss it, especially because we're not active in, like, the book Twitter, like, comment sections. Like, we're not going to be tweeting about this rapidly, but we can do a video discussion where we sort of wrap the whole thing up.
I actively left Twitter because of book Twitter, and now I just survive on book community from Jess.
So yes, again, obviously we are white. When it comes to the perspective of diversity and race, I please implore you to go check out some of the people we've linked down below, because I've done that already. You can go do that right now and come back and watch this live stream afterwards. You don't even have to watch us talk until you have an idea of what's going on. But it is this topic of sort of widely, has Own Voices turned around to bite us in the butt? Has Own Voices started to cause a problem? It's something that was created initially in order to lift diverse people. Has it actually done the opposite now? And like the varying aspects of this and a couple different examples and things that we're going to talk about today. But Gretchen's going to start because she actually did graduate research on stuff like this, so she's smart.
I literally just filmed a video where I called Michaela the brains of the operation. You'll see it eventually, but there's that. So my graduate thesis, I have a master's in children's literature and a master's in library science now. Thank God I got out of that in the last March we had. That's the same March as now. I graduated last year, and my thesis was on diversity vis-a-vis book covers, because there's been a really big discussion about, prior to the Own Voices movement, and then, also past it, this is forever and always, that book covers in particular also have a visibility problem. Even if you can get a diverse author, like their book, to come out, that the diverse body on the cover is often hidden, hooded, in some way, made invisible or less visible even on the cover. So it was looking at this now in an age where covers with people on them are also coming to be more in vogue. There was a really long time where people on covers in general weren't in vogue. And so essentially talking about how there's a little bit of a dichotomy with book covers right now, where the issue is that people are still using these quote unquote symbolic book covers. Think, the Mockingjay pin on the Hunger Games. These get used for books often, but not always. Especially, this is particular to fantasy, I should say, by white authors that they expect to be big. But diverse authors almost always have a person on their cover, because what they're trying to say is, even though we have all of these marketing schemes that say if you use this symbol cover, it's like better marketing for the book, we're still going to put the diverse person on the cover, because in this case, the diverse body is literally being sold. And so talking about critiquing those covers in that way and what it means to have bifurcated. Again, this is a gross generalization. There's like an 100-word thesis that goes into more detail. But also specifically how authors of color in particular, this is an issue because it's harder to represent like a LGBTQIA person unless you're like David Levithan's Two Boys Kissing and it's Two Boys Kissing. Like, it's harder. But specifically how using, for instance, the author Renee Adia, who has diverse people on her covers in various forms of visibility, but then she wrote a vampire novel that also has a diverse main character, and they made it look like Twilight. Because it, in that case, diversity loses to Twilight as like the marketing scheme. So I feel very like, and this is like growing off of like also my undergraduate thesis, which did part of this. So I have feelings.
We've sort of seen discussions where people are talking about how, because social justice is kind of a hot topic right now, like obviously with BLM last year, with a lot more people being more vocal in the past year, possibly because they have more time and energy to do so because they're not working or working as much, whatever it is. That sort of has become, I think, ingrained within publishing as well. They're seeing more criticism on this front, which they have for years. Like, we've talked about Own Voices for years, but I think it's much more like actively vocal and happening more widely across the internet. This has then led publishers to create sort of a gatekeeping thing where, like, before it used to be, and perhaps it is in certain elements still, hey, we have our one queer book for the year, we have our one black book for the year, this publishing house has its one big black author, they have their one big queer author, and that's the only one that they want because that doesn't sell. Now they're saying, no, okay, we want more of these, but only a certain type of these, because outwardly facing, this is what it looks like. And we want to present as if we are obviously diverse and supporting diverse authors, because there's this large population of readers who are calling for it, saying, hey, we want more own voice stories. But that has then turned around, particularly in the queer community, and caused gatekeeping because our diversity is more invisible. Like, obviously you can look at an author who is a person of color and know that they are a person of color and talking about issues that are in their community. There are still, and I know for a lot of Gen Z people, they never had to come out, quote unquote, but for a lot of us millennials and older folks, there are still people in the closet with their sexuality who aren't comfortable discussing that publicly, whether that be because they are hetero passing, like I am assigned female at birth, femme presenting, non-binary individual. That's an invisible identity who's in a relationship with a man, so I look like I am heterosexual. I look that way, and if I were to go to a publisher and I wasn't comfortable to discuss those invisible identities, and I wrote a book about asexuality, they might go, no, because you're not asexual, you're in a relationship with a man, you clearly aren't this, and that's not an Own Voices story. We would rather go to like I don't know what a visibly out person who is asexual would be. So now they're gatekeeping. So now somebody who is part of the community is not allowed to talk about their experiences because outwardly they don't appear to be that way. And there was discussions earlier this year about authors who were forced to come out either by the publisher or by the fans, actually. Even fans of books, or I don't know if I would call them fans, coming into comment section and saying, why are you writing books about queer characters? You're not queer. Whether or not they are, obviously that's a discussion to be had. But this has led this idea of like diversity and the need to be more forward-facing diverse has led to a form of gatekeeping that obviously isn't great.
And can I just say too, I mean, this is all to a certain extent also marketing.
Yeah.
Right? Like you put somebody out and they're like, okay, this is our, LGBTQIA author. Michaela is asexual. And then Michaela like shows up to an event with her partner and they're like, what? Yeah. And so like it's harder to market and to say, if I know one of the articles that we discussed was, a bisexual author who was currently presenting as straight because, they're bisexual.
Yeah.
They may at times present as straight. And, then not being enough. And you do get that too, with the race discussion as well. You're not Black enough. You're not Asian enough. You're not. So that can also be an issue, like just from a marketing term. Like if somebody's going to be like, well, we want to say we're diverse, which means you have to act diverse. Like, yeah. What?
Yeah. That discussion of performative activism, like you need to be the poster child for everybody. This is you. You are representing the whole group. And obviously I have discussed in the past, and we've discussed in the past how we want more own voices stories, but this also means that the publisher is looking for a particular type of own voice story. They want the story to be about your own voices area. So, and what they think your own voices area is, which I think is more accurate. It's not just, it needs to be about what your experience is. It needs to be about what they think your experience is. And then even more what they think will sell about your experience, not necessarily the entirety of it, which is why there's discussions of like, why is it always Black pain instead of Black joy? Why do we want to see, stories about the struggles that Black people have instead of just normal everyday lives of Black people?
There was a great series of articles. These are scholarly articles that came out in 2019, 2020. So, I'm sure no one, has like, no one saw them on like, BuzzFeed or something. But these were scholars talking about how specifically the state of African American young adult literature has really been boxed into a certain kind of story with the fame of The Hate U Give. And it's not that those stories aren't important, but again, if you're a publisher, your decisions for the most part, again, blanket generalization, this is not true of everyone, but if you're a major publisher, you're going to be like, what will make money? I'm looking for the next The Hate U Give. Black Lives Matter is a topical thing. So you're going to get more of those narratives. And this article was saying, so you then as a Black person in America have to be able to present, an African American story from the African American story, first of all. So this often means that you come from, the history of slavery in America, that often you live in the inner city. That's a really big one. And so, there are people who are Black in America, but are recent immigrants from other countries or, live in rural areas. And, not again that the Black Lives Matter is not important, but just saying that publishers will be like, well, since this doesn't fit this diverse pantheon that's selling really well for us, this isn't authentic diversity that we want to sell. Like this is a field. And this was a series of Black literary scholars who were writing this last year. So,
And obviously those stories are written and are out there. There's publishers who do take a chance on some of those stories, or those authors are able to get indie published. They're able to get self-published. So if that's what you're looking for, it's not that those don't exist. They do exist. It's not that all books are only about thugs in the inner city if you're looking for black books. Like, there are, other books that exist out there, but we're talking specifically about the big publishers and sort of what they're looking for, and they're a business. Like, we want to talk about how literature is about, moving social norms that must be in response to what the society wants, things like that. But do keep in mind that publishing is still a business. Are you okay? What happened? Your headphones pulled out?
It's casual.
No. It's still a business, and expecting them to ignore that aspect of it for our sake, it's not going to happen. And
I should say to that, like, all of the examples that I'm talking about are predominantly young adult literature.
Yeah.
And since its inception, young adult literature has been more trend conscious than perhaps any other kind of literature. So there's more room to play sometimes, in adult. In children has some of the same issues, but you don't get those like very like one note trends, like it was mermaids and it was vampires and it blah blah. So when I'm talking about big publishers and publishing trends, I'm specifically coming from young adult publishing, which is incredibly market conscious.
Yeah.
So just in case you're like, well, that doesn't seem true of adult. It's not. It's probably not. I don't know anything about adult publishing.
I mean, it happens across the board too. So, like, I can talk a bit about like SFF stuff because I've looked at some of those trends, not to the same degree. I haven't written a thesis about that, but you'll get publishers who will publish diverse stories, but they might only come out in paperback. Like, this is a book written by a queer author. We're going to publish it still, but it's only going to come out in paperback. Whereas that, like, a very similar story but written by a white male author is going to get the hardback. They're going to get more arcs sent out. They're going to get more publishing on the publisher side. Whereas I feel like with diverse authors, they also have a tendency, at least in SFF that I've seen, to lean more heavily on the author side. Like, hey, you, the author, need to get out and work the streets for your book. Whereas, like, I don't know, Sanderson doesn't need to do that. He's not going around and doing interviews and going around and trying to get podcasts to talk about him. He might do that if somebody reaches out to him, but he doesn't have to, because his publisher is going to back his books and market it. Whereas it feels like a lot of the times, particularly in SFF, that it seems like that onus falls more onto the author than it does. And just the money isn't behind them as much there, especially because with science fiction and fantasy, it's coming from a background of predominantly white men, straight white men writing these things. That's like the genre standard, and anything outside of that is sort of becoming a diversity like checkbox. It's not so much the norm. I mean, I think even years ago we talked about how there was like a year where all the nominees for the Hugo were women, and men got all in a tizzy about it because how could these women be thing?
I'm pretty sure we did have a discussion about that. I feel so old sometimes, and I remember that we've been doing this for like 7-8 years.
Yeah.
God.
But I mean, we're still having those discussions, like in SFF. Like, when people talk about the staple books, even the modern staple classics in fantasy that people need to talk about, there's like 9 men for every 1 woman. Like, that the general readers seem to talk about, at least on BookTube, as far as I've
now,
seen.
I mean, I know, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but just this idea now that, like, if you also decide to swap out like a classic, you're participating in cancel culture. Like that whole thing with, like, it says like, no, I'm just choosing, a different, because we've talked about, just in the past about reading books in high school or in school, and just like
disrupt text, that movement, disrupt text.
Well, yeah, that, but like, just as like readers, like growing up, like why haven't these curriculums changed since the 1950s?
Yeah.
Like, I agree that some of these books are still incredibly relevant and still teach some like crazy themes, or like, oh my God, we were already talking about 1984, like And now that's very relevant to today's society. But like, also, just some of them are just such a drag to read. Like, throw me a more recent novel, and like maybe you have more kids participating in school, just like literally on that level.
Yeah, it's
But
I have discussed this like personally with people about one of my biggest complaints about my English degree was that I was so tired of having to read about old dead white dudes. I don't give a shit. I would like to read more modern texts that include more women, that include more queer characters, that are doing more interesting things, in my opinion, than, you know, Shakespeare did in his books. There's racism in Shakespeare, and we still teach that all the time. Like, there's racism in all of these texts because they're coming from societies that were incredibly prejudiced and racist. And as our society has moved forward, for whatever reason, we sort of stopped moving with it. And now there's this pushback against doing that. Like, why aren't we why did we stop in 1950s and then never move forward again? Or like maybe introducing what, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, maybe some schools that are progressive. Ooh, the 70s. Ooh, we're getting hot in here. But even still, but then that discussion also comes back, and especially tied back into specifically with publishing and diverse books and this performative activism and this gatekeeping that is happening by people who are predominantly not queer but are doing it in reaction to queer or diverse. The people in publishing. Is your cat being weird?
my cat is snoring, and it's the most adorable thing I've ever heard.
Oh.
Sorry.
I lost my train of thought. What was I saying? The people in publishing are predominantly, I feel like, white men and women. There are...
Yeah, so there are statistics done by the publisher Lee and Low, and they released their diversity report, I believe, again last year, and it was like supposed to be like a 5-year retrospective or something. Maybe it was a little bit less than that, but they were like, literally nothing has changed. Like, I mean, the dial had moved like a tiny bit, and we're talking not just about race as well, but like they looked at, you know, the gender gap, the LGBTQIA representation, and they were like, you know, we've been talking about this because I believe We Need Diverse Books has been a thing now it was started in 2014. So, you know, you can start to see like, you know, as this movement has grown, have we made serious gains? And from the Lee and Low report, the numbers that they gathered, they were like,
No.
Nah.
Nothing.
like smidge.
A little bit. And that's not enough, I think, for today's society. I think that after this is why there's so much anger, is that we've been asking for it for so long. And not just us, people of color, more queer representation, all of these people, people from other countries asking for more translated works than just like the big sort of names. Like that sort of stuff has been called for a long time, and not much is changing. Or if it is, it doesn't feel like changing in a good way. But that brings us back to what is happening on the consumer side now. When we talk about book community and we you know watch these videos of book Twitter or Instagram or whatever going off, and all of these people are very vocally and publicly calling out authors and publishers, this is leading to some of these repercussions that we're seeing. It's partially on the marketing side. Oh no, Gretchen left. I hate it when this happens, and also I'm blurry. Why does this happen to me? Gretchen, come back to me. I miss you. Oh.
Isn't it my fault?
I don't know. Is it even? But I miss you. Welcome back.
Okay, apparently you can see me. I don't know what happened here, but we're just going to do it this way.
Oh, okay. Can you not see me? Am I
invisible? I can see you. I can't see me anymore.
Oh, okay. I can see you. You're okay.
Cool.
It's because of this, like, very vocal reaction to things that is making them sort of lightly step around stuff. Because there's this...
And sorry, I was going to say this, and this is also, again, just like not a new discussion.
Yeah.
So when people are like, oh, cancel culture has become such a thing, like, okay, first of all, this is not new.
Yeah.
Like cancel culture as like a general thing is not new. But also, I mean, this is also not the beginning of the question of hashtag own voices either. There's a Refinery 29 article, because I used part of this in my thesis as well. Because again, if there is a huge consumer base that is participating in some cases very rightly calling out publishers and authors for doing bad things, but they're very vocal about it, and it puts more of the onus on people who can adequately perform their diversity, so that these things don't happen. But like, there was a Refinery 29 article basically about what is Own Voices doing to our books, and they were talking about authors of color who had been what we would now consider canceled, because their books didn't match what was considered to be an authentic narrative. So there was one book where there was an Asian author, and they say Asian very intentionally because she had only recently come to America and was publishing her book, and she in her book was using her experiences with sex trafficking in China, and people were saying that she was being like very racist in the lens of African American slavery, like. But she was like, but
they were confusing the allegories that she was using there. Like, she was like, this is supposed to be representative of sex trafficking in China. And people were reading it and thinking that it was supposed to be an allegory of racism in America.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just like the two things didn't mesh. And so she was called out for like treating it in a poor way. And she was like, no, but that's the wrong cultural lens. Like, I'm writing this, from and so that was a very authentic Own Voices experience because it didn't match what was considered culturally authentic in America. Her book was in fact, I think, delayed for a year. It's out now. So, but and that's the authenticity police,
the community not doing that, not the publisher. That's the reader community. And that's for diverse authors. And I talked briefly at the beginning about, again, with queer authors, if they are not, why am I always blurry? I hate when this happens. There I go. It's, if they're an invisibly diverse, like that, again, doubles down on it. But it also then comes back to the question, and I've linked Cindy's discussions down below because she's talked about this recently about should white people be writing diversely, because there's all of these negative effects that are coming back down on the actual diverse authors. If white people then are writing diversely, are they taking the spot of those diverse authors because they're safer, quote unquote? I don't know, but Cindy was discussing how V.E. Schwab's most recent book, Addie LaRue, The Life of Addie LaRue, or whatever the whole title is, she lives for 300 years, and there's like almost none or pretty much no characters of color in that book at all. And people were critiquing it for being unrealistic, because in 300 years you would be interacting with people of color. You would be interacting with them. They exist, and pretending like they don't exist is uncomfortable and feels racist, because it's like, why do you only care about white people? But then on the other hand, she discussed Naomi Novik's Deadly Education and all of the issues when that book came out, because she was trying to write diversely, and then there was this discussion of, obviously white people are going to be coming from a racist lens that they don't necessarily know about. They may say something that is unintentionally racist, and obviously it's important to discuss about the harm that can happen there. But then she gets canceled for that because of an unintentional bias, even though she was trying to be diverse in that case and trying to represent the world accurately and make it important to her book. It wasn't just tokenism. It wasn't just, I'm going to include a Latinx character, I'm going to include a black character. It was important to the world building and like integral to the themes of that book. So that discussion.
And then afterwards she did the work.
Yes. So then specifically with that, when she saw that she had messed up, she like had her publisher remove the thing that was messed up in all future publications of it, so that's not there anymore, the harmful part of it, and she gave a public apology, but people are still sort of labeling her as a racist author or a problematic author because it was there in the first place. So like there's this like continued discussion of like, we as, you know, white creators or white people who may want to write books, who I think we firmly stand in the camp that yes, there should be diversity in your books. Like, we are not the erasure type of people. We think that it's important to at least show that they exist in the world that you're writing. It would be disingenuous to erase them from it. But that also opens us up to critique because, you know, we might mess up. There are implicit biases that we don't even know that we have. There might be language that we use that, from our perspective, isn't harmful, but from another perspective is. And what is the responsibility of the author in that case? Like, obviously you want to get beta readers, but we can't get every single beta reader that ever existed from every single marginalized group ever to exist to read the book. It would never come out. You would just...
And sometimes, I mean, because like Naomi Novak came out and said, you know, she was like, I had sensitivity readers.
Yeah.
You know, like she did work ahead of the publication, this single, and, you know, as opposed to like her having like a problematic character or something, really this problematic thing was like a sentence or two in the book that has been removed. Yeah, like a paragraph. I know I saw it on book community, but I have not actually read the book. But, you know, she was like, you know, I did have sensitivity readers, but these things can get missed also because, you know, there is not, as Michaela said, one person who speaks for every diverse group. And so, you know, some people, even within the diverse group, you need multiple representation because, you know, just because you're African American, just because you're LGBTQIA does not mean that, you know, you're a blanket. It's like not a blanket label. And I think too, a lot of the things, you know, I love, you know, Jess gets really tired about, you know, all these like things happen and the companies go, and we're listening and we're learning. But it's like, okay, but what are you doing? What are you doing? And Naomi Novak was like, here specifically is what I have done.
The steps I've taken.
Well.
But then it feels like that didn't matter because she already messed up at the same time. It's like, okay, so you're calling for like an actual apology. She did that. She did like a heartfelt apology. It wasn't like a scripted, I'm just doing this because I have to, and then I'm going to leave the internet for a couple months and I'll come back when all of this has died down. She did active steps to reverse the harm. I'm going to remove that paragraph from my book and all future publications of it, so it's not there anymore and it can't harm anybody else. Like, those active steps are things that I think that a lot of people call for, like, hey, you know, do this. But then she's still labeled as a problematic author for having done it in the first place, and that comes from a point where it's like, okay, so then who can do anything? How we can't please everyone. It's impossible to please everyone. And when this ties into like one other aspect of this, when like a couple of people say something negative and then a bunch of people that have no actual background in it, that haven't read the book, don't have anything to say about it, hop on the bandwagon because we are so interested in societal change. Like, obviously we need people to support, you know, those people, but when the majority of the people clamoring about a book aren't the ones actually being hurt and aren't actually part of that group, it feels like it becomes more about a performance than it is about actually causing change. So the most recent, well, maybe not now, last week's community talked about a book that hasn't been published yet, Once More with Chutzpah, which is supposed to be a Jewish representation, and how there's a bunch of people talking online already about how it's going to be negative against the issues with Palestine. The book isn't even finished being written yet. Like, she's still in editing. Nobody has read this book. We just got a blurb, and there's already all of this negative buzz about how it's going to be racist in that way. I guess racist, I don't know, ethnocentrically, the issues with that.
And I mean, too, with that, though, is that if you haven't seen this, is that when the book was first announced, there was an uproar about it being about birthright, about it, you know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is a real and serious issue. And this book seemingly not taking that into account. But again, this was literally the book announcement.
Yeah.
But with that, the author made changes to her plot. Like she took that and then made changes. And again, we don't know if those changes were good changes.
Yeah.
You know, we have no idea. But then, like, the book is now released in blurb, and it's like a really big thing. And you know, Twitter can take like a snapshot of a single line and like turn it into internet crazy, or like the snapshot of like, you know, one line from an interview. Like, this is not just about books. And yeah, sometimes that one line, you can be incredibly harmful in one line. I'm not saying that's not true, but it's like, where, you know, what is happening around this? Because if you don't know what the book is going to say.
And obviously, like, we're not ignoring the issues between Israeli and Palestine. We're not saying that, like, that's not a problem. It is a problem. It's definitely something that if you're writing a book that centers around that, should at least acknowledge it. Like, they can't necessarily please everybody about it, but they should at least acknowledge that that's part of it. And it sounds like that's what that author is doing at the very least. But then the discussion comes about, well, that book already was about a diverse thing because it's about, you know, Jewish people. And how many books can you name that are about Jewish people that aren't World War II Holocaust books? Because
also, isn't it LGBTQ? Well, there was something else happening there.
Right? I'm not entirely positive because maybe I'm not positive, but it is one of those things where, like, we don't think about religion necessarily when it comes to diversity all the time, but especially with Jewish folks, that's their culture, that's their, in some ways, their ethnicity as well. And trying to say that the only valid Jewish book is about the Holocaust, having this book trying to come out that's just about, you know, normal teens and what sounds like, you know, identity in the modern times, like, that's incredibly important to publish for, you know, Jewish teens today to read and see themselves represented, not getting slaughtered. Things like that. But then it's like, okay, but then all the Palestinian folks are like, but what about Palestine? But what about this? But what about this? And it's like, okay.
Yes, and we should say, again, we stress that we don't know that this book is not incredibly problematic. Like,
Could
it could very well come out and be incredibly problematic, but no one has seen
the book yet.
The book.
Yeah.
As of this filming. Like, no one, like, both of these were based off of first just the announcement with, like, the one line, this is what the book is. That's like, it's like a paragraph that you see in, like, trade publications. Like, that's what the first Fuhrer was after. And now this is just, like, the longer, like, inside of the jacket blurb.
Yeah.
Also stressing that the author almost never writes those.
Yeah.
Those are written by people who, in some cases, also have not read the book or the whole book. So I'm not sure in that case anything that the author has actually written, except for her letters, like, responding to the controversy. We've actually even seen anything the author has written. And that's, you know, and there is, again, you can say, okay, if you read it, if someone has released a book and, like, the one sentence blurb could be incredibly problematic, where you're like, there is no way you can write this book, and it's like, nope, what are we doing? And unfortunately, books like that still do happen.
Yeah.
In 2021, 2020. But, like, this idea that the entire internet kind of turns on this without knowing how the book handles this thing.
Yeah. We're asking a lot of the books in general. They have to do everything. Sometimes it feels like they have to, you know, represent everything. They have to do it all perfectly. And there's a difference between calling out, like, clear and active issues. And there is a point to saying, hey, you're writing this book about birthright. You need to make sure that you at least discuss, you know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It needs to be in there. And if she hadn't had it in there, that would have been a valid discussion. But this, like, half of the internet, it feels like, coming at this one author, expecting her to do everything feels a little bit unfair. Especially when we discuss that as cancel culture, and a publisher may see this entire discourse that's been happening around just this one book, and somebody else comes up with another book about like Judaism, Jewish teens, Jewish YA book, and say, no, we're not going to do that because we saw the discourse that happened on Twitter with this other book, and it creates another gatekeeping opportunity for a company.
Publishing, we have learned, does not like to learn. They will continue to be like, we want to publish books, because I mean, publishing, when these books are pulled or when they are canceled, that is like a lost investment.
Yeah.
So like, publishing is not going to take this and go, yes, so the next book we acquire with this topic should address this in a smart way. They'll just be like,
don't touch it.
This
is radioactive.
Yeah. And then it just goes back to them just continuing to publish different books on the same thing, because they are going to branch out. And again, we're talking about major publishers here, smaller publishers. This is, again, it's a very blanket statement, but if the goal here is to have the publisher learn, I might be a cynic, but I think it's fairly safe to say that, maybe the author learns, maybe the author's agent learns, but the publisher's not gonna learn.
Yeah. I think that Own Voices was meant to, people, let's go back to just Own Voices in general, because all of this comes back to this Own Voices discussion of like diversity and us wanting to. Own Voices was created to help readers identify own voice texts, with the goal that if we purchase more own voice texts, that publishers may then be incentivized to publish more own voice texts. So it had this twofold thing of, this is an identifier for readers, so that if they want to read an authentic experience, to know that a text is coming from a place of real world experience, this book is tagged with this hashtag, and you can then say, okay, if I want to learn about whatever, you can read this book. Which would then obviously boost that culture, boost that author, and hopefully in turn create change in the publishing industry for the better. Of like, we're seeing more diversity in publishing in general, that, all of these different perspectives are able to come out, and now it's being used to do the opposite, it seems like, to use as a weapon against authors that aren't perceived as, as diverse, or both by the publisher and by the audience as well. If you are only one aspect of something, like, can I write a book with a Latinx character in it who is queer because I have a queer identity, but I'm not Latinx? Is that still an Own Voices text? Because the queer aspects of that are definitely Own Voices, but I'm not Latinx. My partner is. Is that okay? Because I'm in close proximity to somebody who has that identity, so I may have more to say on that topic than your average white person. Like, what is okay and what isn't okay? And it sounds like there is not a consensus online. And then, therefore, the publishers also don't have a consensus other than, like, we see that this one thing is okay, so let's just focus on that. We know that this has been popular and will make us money. Versus...
Yeah, and then two things to that, too, is just really briefly, if we're also talking about authenticity policing. For example, my partner is also half Puerto Rican, but he has never lived in Puerto Rico. His dad is an immigrant. He does not speak Spanish. And, so he, if he, say he were to write a story about his life as, being half Puerto Rican, while his culture is a part of that, obviously all of our cultures are a part of that. Like, is that just, it's a melting pot text, and therefore is that a less authentic, Latinx story? It's not, but if you're going in for, okay, because you're writing a Latinx book, it has to be very cultural. Like, Again, that's not some people's
is
experience.
it Puerto Rican enough? Are you Puerto Rican enough? and I think that ties back to Naomi Novik's book as well, because her protagonist was mixed race. She was half Indian, and people were saying she doesn't feel Indian, so she might as well have been white. Like, what, that you're ignoring real people's experience of being mixed race. And this is a discussion that I'm sure people who are mixed race have had, you know, in general throughout the years, that they don't belong in either community and people want to tag them as one or the other, but their experience is profoundly different than it is to be just one race or the other race. They are mixed race, and that experience is also valid. And saying that they are not enough, or might as well just be white at that point, is completely, in another way, racist as well. Like, it's exclusionary, because we are a diverse world.
Publishing, and throughout its long and a terrible history with trying to publish diverse stories, you know, the important thing about Own Voices also was that to make sure that people were of a culture were telling those culture stories.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the first time there was a major call for diverse stories, publishers said, okay. And then there were white people writing books about, you know, all diversities, because they were like, well, we know white authors, we have these white authors just sitting here, and you asked for diverse stories, so here are stories with people of color, but they're not written by diverse authors. Because publishing has this history of every single time there's a call for this, like, weirdly weaponizing it in some way, like watering it down, which is also a major part of my thesis. Like, okay, you want people of color on the covers of these books, okay, but like, they're gonna be in the shadows, because, like, I mean, they can't fully commit.
Yeah.
I was just reading an article, and it's about, because there's a whole thing about diversity in the film industry right now, especially with the Golden Globes being like, yeah, we don't have any people of color on our board. But they were talking about how, you know, the publishing industry loses, or not publishing, the movie industry loses something obnoxious like 10 billion or something in revenue because they won't publish. I'm conflating terms now because we're talking about publishing, but because they won't produce as many of these.
Yeah.
And it is the same thing with diverse text. They're like, their thing is like, they don't sell, but in fact, diverse stories oftentimes will stay longer on backlists, which is, you know, they won't make as many bestseller lists, although I feel like that is also changing. But they stay on backlists longer, which in the long run means that they make you more money over time.
Yeah.
So like, that was why, again, Own Voices, as Michaela said, is an identifier of like, this is a diverse text written by a diverse person. Spend your money on it, because that's literally the only thing publishing is going to listen to.
Is money.
Is if you say, I choose to buy this book. But yeah, publishing just has, it's like a huge part of my thesis, is they were like, oh yeah, no, we're totally gonna do the thing.
So we can give the example, I think it was last year, was American Dirt, or maybe 2 years ago, with American Dirt, which was published.
God, what is time anymore?
I know, I have no idea. But it got a lot of critical acclaim and was picked up by people like Oprah. And that was a book written by a white person, specifically about people from Mexico who were fleeing Mexico because of the cartel and drug stuff. And like, that was the whole story. And the pushback against that particular book was like, why is a white person writing that story? It wasn't that she was including diverse characters in her story, but it was centered around specifically issues of culture with Mexico and issues that Mexican people face, and especially Mexicans who are immigrants trying to enter the United States. Like, that particular story, and we as people looking for Own Voices, that particular text, we would say, I don't think that one should have been published. Not to say that American Dirt is a bad book. A lot of people really love it. I'm sure that it is very well written. It's very impactful and all of those things. But the idea that a story that is inherently linked to a culture, the trauma that culture experiences as well, centering it and writing that story as a white person, that feels like an overstep. Whereas simply writing a story that includes diverse characters, whether they're the centerpiece, the main protagonist or not, is a completely different discussion. And it seems like a lot of people are conflating the two discussions as the same thing. Of saying, like, well, this white person wrote a diverse book and you're saying that book is bad, but this person wrote a diverse book and that one's good. Like, you're cherry picking. When it's like, no, the issue is, what is the book? What is the content of the book? Are you speaking for someone or including someone in the conversation? Because those are two different things. Saying, these are the issues that Mexicans face, and I'm a white person and I know they face these issues, and I'm going to write a story about it. Versus saying, I'm going to write a world that includes Mexicans, like, or includes a race in a fantasy world that could be an allegory for Mexico, because they exist and their stories are also valid. Like, those are two completely different things. Did I say that well? Does that make sense to you? I don't know.
No, I quite like your phrase, are you speaking for someone or including them in the conversation? And I think because, for the longest time, and you still can, as in the case of, like, for instance, Addie LaRue, have, as a white author, a conversation in a vacuum. And people are like, oh, well, that just is what it is. But, like, if you're trying to be conscious, like, I don't just, like, my entire life has not just been white people.
Yeah.
Like, your fantasy worlds, they're not all white people. Like, and
implying that, especially because a lot of fantasy worlds are historically set, implying that in history they only interacted with white people is actually ignoring a lot of, like, really racially fraught issues in those time periods. Like,
yeah. I mean, as someone who, wrote fantasy, have not been very inspired over the last several years because of my graduate degree and then the plague. The world set itself on fire. Trying to do that consciously, I would hope that if I did the work, in creating my fantasy world, and also doing the work is not just saying, okay, so I have an Asian country. Like, you can also, like, try to say, oh, I'm including diversity, but then it's just like, they're un-Asian. Yeah. And it's like, actually, do you know how many cultures are a part of Asia? It's a very big continent.
Yeah.
So, it's not just, you can't just say, oh, this person has, like, dark skin. If you're creating a fantasy world, you're creating fantasy cultures, fantasy, like, countries, and just think about how many cultures and countries exist on our Earth. So, like, you have to do that work. And obviously, like, I would still be going to people and saying, having sensitivity readers, but, like, as someone who would actively want to do that work to make it an inclusive conversation.
Yeah.
Just how you go about doing that is just.
And especially while doing that, being conscious of how you're doing that, because that, especially with fantasy worlds, it's really easy to, while trying to incorporate diversity, because you only have so much time and space, especially if they're tertiary characters that don't show up very often or get very much screen time, so to speak, easy to reduce them to stereotypes. In order to make it easily identifiable to the public as this is a Chinese equivalent, using certain stereotypes that we have about modern Chinese people as, like, tags. And that's where people run into trouble as well, is that people don't just want that like, this person popped up and was diverse. They want that to be more nuanced, because reducing a race, an ethnicity, a religion, anything like that to a stereotype is always going to be problematic and harmful. It's really hard to do that well. And that's why you see things like Naomi Novik making her protagonist mixed race, because if we only had the side characters as the racial identifiers, and they don't get as much screen time. We don't get in their head. You don't see them as people. They just become caricatures. And that's
yeah. And I mean, the same thing also, you know, with sexuality as well, like the male gay best friend, and like that being like the single male gay representation when in fact there are.
Or the bury your gays trope, where the third character, who is the gay character, dies at the end. And it's like, well, great, okay, you included us in the conversation, but you keep killing us off. Like, that's not helpful to us either. So, it's so nuanced and feels at times impossible. Especially when you work so hard, and I think do really well in a lot of cases, make the diversity important to the plot. Make the diversity important to the themes. Have these characters show up and be real, holistic characters where their culture is both visible and important. Their sexuality is visible and important to their character building without doing it stereotypically. And if you mess up, then you're canceled. You're labeled as racist forever. Like, looping it back. And even if you try and do the correct thing, which is to say, okay, we're going to edit that. Any future elements of the books don't have that. We're going to use sensitivity readers to try and catch it before it's published. But if we do mess up and it gets published with something, because the publishing industry is so white and straight and het and, you know, cisgendered, all of that stuff, it's like the system is actively working against themselves. And then we, the readers, are trying to do good, but are also actively working against ourselves because we're the systems that we're using to try and promote things aren't actually doing their intended purpose. So yes, it was intended for this, but it's being used in this way. Do we just get rid of own voices? I don't think that that's valid. I think that we should still have own voices because it is still helpful to, at the very base of it, to be able to identify own voices texts.
And with, you know, even with all of this having, you know, all of this talk, all this conversation, like the people in publishing are still very like white, like, and there is a thing, the numbers are going up, but like, just because again, publishers choose to focus on, they're like, okay, we'll put a lot of money behind Angie Thomas, which is great. Angie Thomas deserves their money. Throw it at her, please. But then they're like, and then every other book we publish for the next 3 months will basically be white. And so like you think, okay, so I've gone into Barnes and Noble and there's so many people of color, you know, own voices, whatever it is, on display, you know, this problem is fixing itself. It's not. Displays in places like Barnes and Noble are paid for by publishers. Yeah. So they could have their books on that and then...
Oh no, Gretchen left. I think what she was going to say was they can have their books on display, have Barnes & Noble build a table or an end cap, and be like, check mark, hit our diversity quota for the year. Don't need to do anything else. Does that sound valid? Did you hear what I said? What I thought that the end of your thought was? Okay.
Yeah, I really don't go anywhere. Like, it just, like, shuts off my camera for I'm the only one using my internet. This is the only platform on which I have this issue. Don't ask me.
Dang it, Discord.
I don't know. Maybe it's because, you know, we've been talking for about an hour now, and it's like, my computer's sick of me. I don't know.
Get on with it.
Because, I mean, I think, you know, normally when we have these discussions, our point is not that we have answers.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers. Yeah. I mean, there is. Just don't be racist.
Don't be racist.
But, like, don't be racist. That's a pretty big answer. But, like, you know, for this more nuanced discussion, you know, you can't get rid of own voices. But, you know, own voices also needs to be all voices.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, you know, I don't need, like, a neo-Nazi own voices. Thank you, no. But, like, it needs to understand that, you know, just because you have, like, an African-American person, their story can include other things. You know, just because you have an LGBTQIA person, they have other things in their life besides struggling to come out. That's, you know,
yeah.
And having, like, a really, like, traumatizing time with that. Yes, absolutely, many people have that experience, but also some people, you know, it's not the defining point of their high school experience or something.
And also, queer people exist outside of teenagers. So like there's been this discussion of like there's actually like a fair amount of representation of queer lit in YA, but because of the nature of YA, those stories are centered around discovering your identity, coming out, or experimenting with your sexuality or your identity in some way. And there's like that's such a small range of experience of life. And then when you go to the adult section, there's far fewer representations there. Like how many queer romances are in the romance section, or do they get shuffled off into the gender studies or the sexuality studies, social studies area of the store? How many queer centered just literary fiction books are there? There's more. They're slowly coming out, but there's more than just that struggle. But because people outside of the community are interested in that because they don't have that experience, there's this, I guess that goes into the discussion of like what they expect, because they expect the normal reader to be cis white heterosexual. They're looking at what that person finds interesting, which is not going to be, and that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah. And I mean, like, do keep in mind too with publishing that it's very rare for books to in some way get fast tracked.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's all the time it takes for an author to write the book. So let's just be incredibly optimistic and say it takes a person a year to get their book together. It oftentimes takes much longer than that, unless you're like Rochelle Mead, who can turn out a new book every 9 months. Don't understand that. But it takes, that's a year, first of all. Then they have to find an agent. We'll just say for the ease of this math, because I can't do math, that's another year of querying. And then that agent has to find a publisher, and then that publisher sends it through a round of edits. So, I mean, when you really think about the books that are new releases this year, have often been written for like 3-4 years.
Yeah.
So also, and again, that book gets acquired and then gets published usually at least a year out. Yeah. If not more. So, and when we're talking about like things slowly changing, there is just also this, there's a backlog in publishing in that
time
sense.
Limitation to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in conclusion, we still have questions. We don't have the answers, but we feel, yes, white people should be writing diversely because it feels disingenuous to erase other cultures, other identities. That doesn't feel good to us in 2021 when, sure, that book is great. No, you shouldn't be speaking for other cultures, but you should be including them in the conversations in your text. You should try as best you can to avoid stereotyping, because those things often lead to harm. We need diverse beta readers, sensitivity readers, and pay them for that. Pay those people to do it. Don't just come up to a diverse person on the internet and say, read my thing and do a bunch of emotional labor for me. Pay those people.
Pay people for their work.
Yes. And then do still try to support authors who are visibly diverse, but don't immediately attack authors who you don't believe are doing it correctly, unless it is actively harmful. I think that's the line that we're sort of saying, is that we see a lot of people attacking people before we know whether something is harmful. There's like a preemptiveness of like, oh, this has the potential to be harmful, or attacking people for not being enough, not being the correct type of something.
Not being, in the case of LGBTQIA authors, not actively being out.
Yeah.
I mean, could that absolutely be used as a shield for, there's a whole discussion about, straight white women writing LGBTQIA, like gay guy books, like romance books, like that's like a subset. And that's, yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, you can tell that they are not gay men as women, but, it's just like I understand that there is a part of that discussion where somebody could be saying, yeah, I totally like kissed a girl once. That makes me a lesbian. It doesn't. Not just the one time. But like, we also can't force people to be performing, you know, their identities.
So we as a community need to be better at identifying when what we're saying is helpful or harmful. And I don't think that we've figured that out yet as the bookish internet. I don't think that we're in a place where we know what is helpful and harmful. We're trying, and that's important, and trying does lead to change, but I think that right now we're being more harmful than helpful in a lot of instances. And that's not, I think, what the goal is, especially of Own Voices in particular. It was supposed to be more helpful than harmful. These things aren't supposed to be weapons to attack people. They're supposed to be tools to lift and support people, not the opposite. And I think that in general the internet is much more interested in going on a witch hunt than they are in handing a helping hand to somebody, if that makes sense. It's much more fun to be angry than it is to be kind. Just in general, I feel like that's accurate.
I mean, but also just people who are angry are more vocal.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the whole thing with, you know, you can't trust reviews for anything, because if you go to a restaurant and you enjoy the experience, you know, you enjoyed the experience and that's like period, like you're done. Yeah. And maybe you'll go back and you'll give them your money. But if you have a bad experience, you're much more likely to go and write a review.
Yeah.
And so it's that kind of an idea. Like if it's good,
we've talked about that with reviews just in general.
It's much easier to review a bad book because you have things to say.
Yeah. Or
like,
what
that feel relevant.
That is extremely good. But all of these things that are good but okay, like there's this huge spectrum where we're like, I read this, but I don't really have a way to talk about it because I don't have something to say. I don't have a major critique, and I don't have like something major that they did above and beyond my expectations to talk about. So I don't know. We don't have answers. We've come to the conclusion we don't have answers. Again, at the end of this, I'm going to implore you, please go watch those other videos that I linked below, because those are diverse people of color who are adding to the conversation. Look at their comment sections as well, because they are not a monolith. They cannot represent the entirety of the spectrum, but the people in the comments can at times, and be open to the fact that they disagree, because again, they're not monoliths. They don't represent the entirety of stuff. There are people who disagree. There's people who's going to disagree with us, and that's perfectly valid, because we don't represent everybody and everything, and in fact we are part of, in a lot of ways, the oppression that these diverse groups are facing, intentionally or unintentionally. I don't think that I ever want to intentionally like squash something, but at the same time it could happen, and I might not mean to do it, and it's unintentional. And I think it's important for us to discuss this and to hold ourselves accountable to that, because it's really easy as white people to just forget, to just put our heads in the sands and shut down.
Because, like, like we said, like, if we wanted to, if we were writing a book, we could just write it and everybody would be white.
Yeah.
And people would be like, okay. But, like,
we also have the privilege of probably getting picked up for writing these diverse stories more than a diverse author would be, because we don't have to represent that culture in the same way. We do have that privilege, and we're acknowledging that as well, just in general. And as somebody in the LGBTQIA community, I can write about any other group in that community, and it's pretty much seen as acceptable because you're in the community, you're part of the community. Even though I am not a gay man, it would be more acceptable for me as a queer individual to write about a gay story than it is for Gretchen to. Just in general, like, what does that say? Too many discussions. That's why we do this, to talk about it. I hope that you guys talk in the comments down below. I hope that you guys go onto other folks' videos and watch and discuss there as well. And I hope that we can, as a community, come together and sort of decide what we want to do more behind movements to create change, rather than just going on witch hunts and canceling people, because I don't think that that's helpful in the long run. Personally, necessarily. Unless they're, like, actively harming, not trying to change, actively being a piece of shit. then yes, cancel those people. Were you saying that that's what you were doing?
No, I was just saying bye-bye.
Oh, yes, bye. All right.
Here's the door.
Have a good night, folks. We'll talk to you again soon.